conference and welcome you on behalf of the Women and Public Policy program at the Kennedy School that Swanee Hunt is the director of and I'm the faculty chair of, and on behalf of the Women's Studies in Religion program at the Harvard Divinity School, which Ann Browdy is the head of. We've worked hard to put this conference together, and I think there have been a large number of high points so far, and we're very happy about that. At the beginning of the conference, Maureen Fitzgerald said, well, we've got to make sure not to be too nicey-nicey and just be so polite that no issues will come out. And we all vowed that we were not going to be so nice that no issues would come out. But we do want to make sure that when the issues come out, they come out with respect and safety. I know that you all have been working hard and thinking hard. There have been a lot of important issues put on the table today. We want to carry on that process of working hard and thinking hard. And in the groups last night, we've heard lots of very good things about the groups last night. Lots of major issues came on the table in different groups. And some may have said some things and not felt heard. We know that when you say something, it doesn't always end just when you say it. The tapes keep going in people's heads. But that may not be enough for right now. I think if we're not going to stifle conversation, if we're going to really bring out all the issues, we've got to create a respectful and safe place for everyone here to speak. So the rules of respectful engagement, I'm sure many of you just know them instinctively, but one that you might not think of right away is that when someone says something with which you really disagree, one way to kind of help out the respect is to just pause for a minute and let that person know that person's been heard. That doesn't mean agreeing or nicey-nicey, but just make sure that person knows that she has been heard. And also, we all know what it's like to be in a minority. Every single one of us has taken an unpopular stand. So when there's someone who's in a minority in a group, let's provide a safe space for her. That the reason for doing this is not to stifle the conversation with niceness. That would be exactly the opposite to what we want. It's to let the conversation come forth, because if people are biting their tongue or just worse than biting their tongue, what really happens, as I'm sure you've all experienced, is you just kind of give up. You sort of withdraw, you retreat inside yourself, you say, this isn't a place that's ever going to listen to me. So that's what we want not to happen. We want a lot of voices out on the table here, because we hope that this conversation is going to be a conversation that goes on and on. This, in our eyes, is not just a one-time event. We hope, the beginning of something a lot bigger than just the group gathered here. Everybody we've spoken to and about this event has, whether they themselves are right now immersed in a faith community or not, has been intrigued and interested, and many, many people galvanized by the idea that we're bringing the women, religion and public policy together in a way that is forward-looking, looking to what we can do in the future. So I'm very happy we're all here. We're going to have a wonderful series of panels this afternoon and later in-depth discussions. So welcome again. I want Ann Browdy, I want to welcome Ann Browdy to the podium. She, as I said, is the head of the Women's Studies and Religion program at the Harvard Divinity School, and I've heard several people say that that's the absolutely best program at the whole Divinity School. She's an historian. She's written about the religious history of American women, and like Swanee Hunt and me, she's a new girl on the block. She's just come to Harvard in the last 3 years. So we're all, three of us, engaged in trying to change the face of this place. You notice the word trying. But we're beginning to succeed little by little, and this conference is one way of doing that. People are sitting up and taking notice about what we're doing here. So I'll now introduce Ann Browdy. Thank you.
Thank you. One of the important goals of this conference is not only to bring together three areas of concern that are rarely discussed in the same context, but also to bring together scholars and activists. And you see that in the group before you. And we wanted to bring together the people whose research provides new information about all the areas that you're working on with those who have the concrete experience and who need this information to structure the programs and projects that you are all that you're all executing out in the world. Marian Wright Edelman's opening address last night really made me think about all the scholars whose work provided the information that she so nimbly wove together into her own moral vision and into her own social program. I thought about the historians who recovered the stories of the black women freedom fighters of the 19th century who served as her role models, and I thought about the social scientists who helped us understand what the actual conditions in our society are that require our attention. And I also thought about the policy analysts who help us assess the outcome of specific policies to tell us whether they in fact will be child-friendly or not in the terms that Edelman expressed. And last but not least, I thought about the scholars of religion who are working to restore to our faith tradition the voices of women like Marian Wright Edelman that are so infrequently heard within religious structures when debates occur about what are the social policies that our faith traditions require of us and suggest. So we looked for a scholar who could help us bridge the gap between scholarship and activism to provide an address to the group this morning. And we looked for someone who is herself both an activist and a research scholar in the field of religion. And we found that person in today's speaker, Kathleen Sands. Kathleen Sands is an associate professor at the University of Massachusetts in Boston, a secular, urban, public educational institution where she teaches courses in religion to a diverse group of first-generation college-educated students, many of whom are immigrants who are preparing for citizenship in a country where the diversity of religion is something they have never experienced before. When I was looking at the bios of the scholars in your book, I noticed that they tend to de-emphasize their academic preparation, which if you were hearing an introduction in another part of the university would occupy an enormous amount of time and attention. And I thought I would just give you a few details that are excluded from Kathleen's bio to show you that someone with so many fancy degrees is not in fact disqualified from providing helpful commentary on the subjects that concern us. Kathleen Sands received the AB degree from Boston University, where she was in the first graduating class of the University Professors Program, a very distinguished program. She received the master's in theology from Harvard Divinity School, and finally her doctorate from Boston University and Andover Newton Theological Seminary in systematic theology and ethics. She has many previous publications, many of which are listed in the bio book, but one of the things that really drew our attention to her as the perfect speaker for this event is a forthcoming publication that will appear from Oxford University Press in the spring, entitled Religion and Sex in American Public Life. And this book is something fairly new in religious studies, because its goal is to look at an issue in the public sphere in which religion is often invoked to defend specific policies, but is rarely analyzed as part of the discussion, and to which very little scholarship has been about that religion has been addressed. This book is an effort to ask scholars of religion to address their expertise to a public issue of broad concern, and that's one of the things that we hope that this conference will encourage. And so we'll ask Kathleen to start out this morning. Thank you.
Good morning. Well, since the millennium is fast approaching, and since it falls to me to begin our conversations this morning from the standpoint of religion, let me start with a story that's benignly apocalyptic. This happened early one morning as I caught a cab for the airport to travel to an academic conference. My driver was delivering a little soliloquy of small talk, and I was just half taking it in. But then, not long into our trip, I thought I heard him say, "Walls, to me, they're like water. I go right through them." Naturally, this captured my attention. The driver explained that his special abilities come from a religious calling. Relieved not to have told him that the conference I was heading to was for the American Academy of Religion, I sat back to listen. When he was a little boy, he said, Jesus had started coming to him, sitting at the foot of his bed. As an aside, he mentioned that Jesus was black, like my driver himself was black. People didn't know that, he said, and it would be better if they did. I agreed. Now I was starting to admire his theological insight. Over the years, he said, Jesus had begun to give him jobs. For example, he referred to a recent series of hurricanes and bragged that they would have taken out the entire eastern seaboard had it not been for his personal efforts. At that point, I fastened my own seatbelt and began to experience a sudden renewal of my own religious faith. He went on to describe other sacred missions which concerned social injustices as well as natural catastrophes. God brought him to heaven and said, "James, go to earth and find out what is the problem between men and women, and report back." Finally, James himself had been elected God in Heaven's stadium, he said. Not by secret ballot, he added, because in heaven everyone pretty much knows everyone else's business. He was to take over as God the following January on a specific date. I guess he figured that God's elect are inaugurated around the same time as presidents elect. Anyway, he said when he became God, every single person on earth would be issued something like a credit card. And with that credit card, we'll all be able to get, at no cost, all we need of housing, food, health care, education, and entertainment. As we reached the airport, James was repeating the date, urging me to remember it. And when that day comes, he said, as I stepped out of the cab, be sure to tell them that you met me. You know James. Otherwise, he warned, you're going to wait in a long line. From a psychological point of view, I guess we'd have to say that James was deluded, or maybe what he had was less a delusion than an illusion. The difference being that people with delusions have no idea they have them, and that illusions, unlike delusions, can sort of help you in a way to navigate your way around the world. Freud said, of course, that religion itself was an illusion, and many since have agreed. Still, in terms of finding his way around, I'd have to say that James had the most ingenious route to Logan that I've ever seen. And although claiming to be God-elect is theologically off the map, ethically speaking, I thought that James's compass was quite perspicacious. After all, he knew that there is a problem between men and women, a problem that even God, at least the way we usually conceive God, has not been able to comprehend. He knew that images of God are distorted by profound racial bias, such that to think of blackness, or indeed anything other than whiteness, as a vessel of the sacred was not possible for many people, especially, we could add, white people. And he had a social vision which may seem utopian, but should not have to be. A vision in which basic resources would be shared and basic human needs would be met. He realized that what's basic for human beings are not just the needs of the body, but those of heart and soul. bread and roses, as we say. And he understood that this should not be too much to expect from God or from each other. Women in our country have a particular stake in whether religion is taken to be delusory, illusory, or visionary, whether it's regarded as a help or a hindrance in getting us where we want to go in the coming millennium. In the U.S. today, religion becomes most publicly visible in connection with issues of family, sex, and reproduction, which are all in some ways debates about women's lives and women's roles. On a more subtle level, these are also debates about race and racism, poverty and social responsibility, cultural differences and cultural hegemony. All this is encoded in what's said about religion or faith-based communities or in the name of family values and personal responsibility. Now, none of these, family, religion, personal responsibility, are things that most Americans oppose in principle. Yet we know that when these terms enter public discourse, they usually signal particular political views, for example, on abortion, on gay rights, on public education, social provision, crime, and taxation. And these are views held by many Americans, but they're also views that many other Americans consider inimical to the full participation of women in American public life, especially women who happen also to be poor or non-white or non-English speaking. So whether this is really true or not, there seems to be a standoff between feminism and religion. Whatever the exact nature of this conflict, it's not just between women and religion, though. It's also between women and other women. Women play a central role, if not always in the leadership, always in the rank and file of religious conservatism. The conservative group Concerned Women for America, for example, today boasts a membership as high or higher than that of the National Organization for Women. Moreover, women who disidentify with the tag feminist are not only more likely to be religious than are feminist women, they're also more likely to be highly educated or to occupy professional or managerial positions. According to the popular view, white women are also more likely to be feminist than are women of color. However, some recent studies suggest quite the opposite. Still, even among feminists, this difference over religion appears. For as we know, there are women who call themselves feminists or womanists or mujeristas in just about every religious body in the U.S. And for reasons I'll get to shortly, the bond with religion may be most enduring for women who are religious or cultural minorities. For example, African American women, Latinas, Asian American women, Muslim women, Native American women. In short, the feminism that turns its back on religion is not only turning away from its religious allies, but from poor women and minority women, including many women who might otherwise identify as feminist. So when we look at religion as it impacts on women's public lives in the U.S., we're studying a number of fault lines between women and other women over the idea of feminism, between feminists over the idea of religion, and within religions themselves over the question of women. Given these really profound differences, my aim today is not to discover common ground on which women, religion, and public policy might meet. This is not to say there is no such common ground. Marian Wright Edelman eloquently named some of its features for us just last evening. But my own work on these topics has convinced me that the root problem is the very categories of religion and secularity as they've been constructed in our history and in relation to feminism. So instead of common ground, I would like to create some level ground on which feminism and religion can be rethought in continuity with each other. Level ground on which we can communicate more intelligibly, delineate the disagreements more coherently, and seek out the places where new dialogues and new alliances might begin. I think the first question to address is this: why is the public discourse around women and religion focused only on one kind of religion and one kind of feminism? Religion, as we know, is largely represented in terms of the religious right, assumed to refer mainly to conservative evangelical Protestantism. Feminism, on the other hand, is represented as largely white and as strictly secularist. Moreover, this feminism and this religion are presented as in perpetual combat. Now, these representations are not fictions. The forces and the conflicts they portray are very real, but they're hardly the whole American story, and that should make us wonder why they so dominate the public discourse. One reason I'm going to suggest is that anti-feminist religion and secular feminism have come to need each other in a peculiar way. Sure, the relationship between them is not great. In fact, it's what we'd call highly dysfunctional. But as we know, dysfunctional relationships are often the most enduring kind. I'm suggesting that conservative religion now accrues so much cultural power not simply because it is religion. On the contrary, at this historical moment, it gains cultural credibility as religion only to the degree that it is conservative in particular ways. And feminism, by the same token, has come to rely on a particular secularist ideology as the source of its public authority. In other words, the predominant forms of feminism in the U.S. have come to rely on the very definition of religion that makes their conflicts with religion so intractable. The mainstream of feminism in the U.S., as we know, has been liberal feminism. And as liberal, it draws on the modern Western tradition of defining the public sphere by excluding religion. Secularity belongs to the very foundations of modern Western society. So secularism became basic to the way modern Western society legitimates itself. And like all legitimations, it's deployed even when a society is not being legitimate, even when it's not living up to its own ideals. Secularism makes the claim that the modern state, the modern economy, the modern academy are all unlike religion in just about every way. It claims that modern society, unlike religion, is inclusive rather than particular. That, unlike religion, it is based on reason rather than on faith. That, unlike religion, it is democratic rather than authoritarian. That, unlike religion, it is determined by the free choices of individuals rather than by external constraints, and so forth. Of course, these claims have never been completely true, nor could they ever be. But even when untrue, they are regulatory. That is, they control access to the great powers of the public sphere. And that's why they're so extremely important for our purposes. This, as I say, is the heritage of liberal feminism. It's colloquially manifest in the preference for terms like rights, equality, freedom, privacy, tolerance, choice, inclusivity, and diversity, over terms like obligation, community, commitment, authority, tradition, and responsibility. It's at work when feminists issue sweeping characterizations and facile denunciations of religion, as if the banishment of religion from public life would banish also the political disagreements between Americans on questions of sexuality, family, race, poverty, and gender. The verb to impose is usually a very good marker of what I'm talking about. It allows liberal secularists to decry the imposition of values by the religious right without having to spell out a social ethic of their own. Curiously, this unreflective secularism reiterates the very sin for which it faults religious conservatism, the sin of absolutism. We're engaging in absolutism when we conduct our public discourse as a kind of language game that our opponents can't play and therefore can't win. For example, when one uses the term choice in relation to abortion, or in relation to gay rights, terms like tolerance, homophobia, or heterosexism. After all, who wants to take the side of intolerance? Who wants to agree that what they see as their moral opinion is really just an erotic phobia? Who wants to identify themselves as opposed to freedom or to choice? Those of us who use these terms on our opposition should remember what it's like to be on the losing side of one of these language games. That is, to be rhetorically positioned so that we're made into enemies of the family or of God or of personal responsibility or even the enemies of life. Now, I'm certainly not suggesting that terms like sexism, homophobia, or heterosexism, or the whole set of cognate terms are not meaningful, or that there's no place for them. Nor would I say that about terms like family values, or God, or personal responsibility. But the place for these terms is not among citizens who are at odds with each other on the political issues behind these terms, and who are trying to engage in democratic deliberation about them. To illustrate what I mean, let me quote a few lines from Andrea Dworkin's powerful polemic, Right-Wing Women. She writes, "Either the arguments of anti-feminism, one by one or the whole lot, are true or they are not. Either women are morally better than men or they are not. Either women have sexual power over men simply by being women or they do not. Either men are dominant by nature or will of God or they are not. Anti-feminism says all of this is true. Feminism says it is not. The so-called feminism that says some of it is true and some of it is not cannot combat anti-feminism because it has incorporated it." End quote. Now, a scholar of religion cannot help noticing that the way Dworkin speaks of feminism is like what many religious believers say of their faith. Not just, this is true for me, but if this is true, it's true for everyone. Either Jesus Christ is the Son of God or he is not. Either Muhammad is the prophet or he is not, and so forth. Either you get it or you don't. If you get it, you'll never see the world in the same way again. In other words, if you get it, you'll have what amounts to a conversion experience. But if you don't get it, this language will lock you out. So as a language game, it's all or nothing. Dworkin's language, in other words, is the language of testimony. And just as it's fitting for her to express her feminism this way, it's also fitting for religious people to testify to their faith and to invite others to conversion. But while testimony is the native language of faith, deliberation must be the native language of democracy. There's an important place for testimony within the process of deliberation. It allows believers to express themselves, and it offers a powerful witness to unbelievers. But democratic agreements are usually of a smaller sort than is conversion. So it's not enough to speak the language of testimony, and not enough even to listen respectfully to the testimony of others. We also have to foster a language of democratic deliberation, intended not only to persuade others lock, stock, and barrel to our own beliefs, but to communicate with unbelievers and to negotiate the partial alliances and the provisional agreements that constitute normal life in a pluralistic democracy. In noticing the links between mainline feminism and secularism, and in suggesting that we look at feminism and religion in continuity with each other, I don't mean to endorse the notion that secularism itself is a kind of religion. Although I think there is a measure of truth to this claim, people who make it usually mean one thing or another that I would heartily dispute. Sometimes they mean that there's only one true religion and that secularism is not it. Or they may mean that Christianity is our true national religion. Sometimes they seem to imply that genuine secularity is not possible or not even desirable. None of these are positions I would support. Secularity, in its appropriate meaning, is absolutely necessary. It's a fundamental condition of a pluralistic democracy. Authentic secularity demands that our public life has to be capacious enough to admit and to amplify the voices of all the religious, non-religious, and anti-religious views that comprise our society. But here's my point. This capaciousness, this genuine secularism, is not established by proclamation. It's not there just because some of us say it is, and it's certainly not there by virtue of devaluing or disqualifying everything labeled religion. Authentic secularity is something that has to be negotiated and renegotiated in ongoing ways, and those negotiations have to include religious voices. These days, unfortunately, secularism often asserts itself simply by excluding religion, although its real legitimacy depends on its ability to include all citizens in the democratic process. These days, too, the assertion of religious freedom is most often a call for exemption from public norms, when it really should be a demand for participation in the formation of public norms. When it comes to thinking clearly about religion in our public lives, it's almost as if we've developed a kind of national learning disability. How did we get to this point? One determinative factor, of course, is the First Amendment. Together, the No Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause make religion into a unique composite of special exclusions and special privileges. The interpretation of the First Amendment by delineating this category, religion, also inevitably delineates that which is not religion, in other words, the secular. Now, this secular will not really be devoid of religion. Many religious elements will take up residence within it. And that, too, is inevitable. But not every religion can do this. It's only elements of the dominant religion that can really blend into the secular. At least they blend in as far as members of the dominant religion are concerned. It's not necessarily so for others. Christmas trees, for example, are seen by many Christian Americans as secular, but often appear quite Christian to American Jews. In the course of modernity, scholars agree, religion itself has changed dramatically. In the U.S., this is partly due to the proliferation of religions, so that the old triad of Catholic, Protestant, and Jew really no longer comes close to describing our religious diversity. Islam, for example, is now the fastest growing religious minority in the U.S. Religion's also been changed by secular factors, the rise of mass culture, the development of modern scholarship, the extension of the state into areas formerly covered by religion. Now, the growing complexity of the secular means that religions become less able to guide people around in every part of their lives. And as religion loses the capacity to cover life as a whole, religion also has less contact with those rational, norms, and those democratic procedures which ideally characterize the secular. So religions, besides becoming less welcome in public life, also tend to become less able to function appropriately in the public arena. Meanwhile, in the secular world, things that used to be produced by religion are being massively generated by the academy, the state, and above all, the market. Far from being neutral, rational, and free, the secular world is jammed with symbols and beliefs, rituals and saviors, sacred texts, and inviolable norms. Most of these elements are not visibly attached to religion, although they influence our lives as much or even more than religion does. But because they're in the realm of the secular, they aren't scrutinized the way we would scrutinize religion. So there's no adequate way to really name the unfreedom and the irrationality in our public lives. No way to carefully examine the values and beliefs that shape our politics. Take, for example, the belief that economic standing depends fundamentally on personal merit. This belief, which I think deserves to be called theological, or at least quasi-theological, is now determining a lot of social policy. Yet it's a belief which, to say the very least, warrants critical examination. Under today's circumstances, the special exclusions and the special privileges of religion begin to look like incompatible absolutes, although of course they were meant to balance each other. Today, liberal secularists want religion to be subject to its special exclusions, but not to enjoy its special privileges. Religious conservatives want the special privileges of religion, but don't want the special exclusions. So, for example, if some people argue that abortion or gay rights or assisted reproduction should not be legal because they're opposed by many religious teachings, others will argue that religious opposition to abortion or assisted reproduction or gay rights, precisely because it is religious, is irrelevant to public discourse. In other words, each side asserts its claims in hegemonic terms, terms that really resist articulation because they're meant to go without saying. This is only human. We all like to win battles without actually fighting them. That's really the great thing about hegemony, when you have it. Unfortunately, though, there are many battles for women that nobody is winning very well today, and in these we should consider laying down the hegemonic sword and shield. Of course, there was a time before this, notably the 19th century. At that time, most feminism was positively connected to religion, especially to evangelical Protestant Christianity. Religious faith gave women an unprecedented public voice, a powerful source of inspiration, personal vocation, and spiritual authority. It also gave women a social mission, which included the fight against slavery, domestic violence, poverty, and sexual exploitation. Joanna Lee, the Grimke sisters, Sojourner Truth, Frances Willard, Maria Stewart, Anna Julia Cooper, and many, many other 19th century women leaders, black and white, would fit this description. Even Elizabeth Cady Stanton remained a deeply spiritual person, and for all of her very fierce criticisms of Christianity, took it seriously as a cultural force to which women therefore had to lay claim. But when we think of 19th century women's movements, it's not primarily the famous women we should call to mind. The women's movements of the 19th century, both among black women and among white women, accomplished so much because they were movements. Because countless ordinary, unremembered women organized and raised funds, held meetings, worked with the poor, preached, started schools and libraries together. Religion, in this sense, served as the bridge between 19th century women and public life. Or if not a bridge, at least a kind of a front porch that mediated between home and society. Whether bridge or porch, this is a sharp contrast to our own time. Now, when religion enters the public square, it's usually to call women, at least mothers, back inside. Until recently, 20th century feminist historians have tended to look askance at the religious dimension of 19th century feminism. And there are some very serious criticisms to make of parts of white 19th century religious feminism. For instance, the branch of the women's suffrage movement, which appealed to white racial fears during the battle over the 15th Amendment. The various purity movements of the time, when led by white women, sometimes did carry tones of class condescension and of anti-immigrant feeling. On the symbolic level, too, evangelical white Protestant feminism of the 19th century is now widely regarded to have been flawed and biased, because it based women's political authority on her supposedly special spiritual authority, and that spiritual authority in turn was connected to an ideal of Victorian womanhood. That ideal of Victorian womanhood, sometimes called the angel in the house or the cult of pure womanhood, fit the experience of a lot of white middle-class women, but it certainly didn't do much good for women who did not look like or live like angels in the house. Still, to toss religion out of women's political history is to lose a great deal, as Constance Buchanan shows in her excellent book on this topic. First of all, 19th century feminism was both a white and a black women's movement, and to subsume it under critiques of white feminism, even appropriate critiques, tends to erase that important fact. Also, 19th century religious feminism was able to translate motherhood into a public issue. Motherhood, in other words, became not just a question of woman's responsibility to the nation, but the nation's responsibility for the conditions of family life. In our current political climate, where feminism is so often represented as anti-motherhood, this is a connection we do very well to revive. Finally, Buchanan argues 19th century religious feminism saw itself as a movement for the common good. In other words, it was about social well-being, not just about individual rights. Today, as we know, the most common moral charge made against feminism is that it's just one more expression of selfish individualism. This charge, while often unfair, does underline the need for feminists today to think and to speak in terms of the common good. One historical factor behind feminism's shift from its religious key in the 19th century to its secular key in the 20th century was a conflict within Protestantism itself in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. On one side was Protestant liberalism or modernism, on the other side, Protestant fundamentalism. As historian Margaret Bendroth shows, this conflict happened at a time when women's power in the Protestant churches had risen very sharply, largely as a result of feminist efforts. Now, this led to campaigns at that time to remasculinize Protestantism, to create what came to be called a muscular Christianity. For liberals, this did not entail anti-feminism, but for fundamentalists, it did. Indeed, for fundamentalists, liberalism with its feminist sympathies exemplified the spineless effeminacy of a Christianity that no longer dared to stand out in the public square. Now, as we know, liberal feminism won this particular cultural battle in the 1920s, and fundamentalism went into decades of retreat from public life. But for our purposes, what's important to notice is that by the 1920s, white Protestant feminism was now allied with a liberalism that was merging imperceptibly into the American secular landscape. That set the stage for what would happen in the 1960s and 70s, when just as a new wave of feminism began, liberal Protestantism went into decline. Soon thereafter, evangelical Protestantism was to resurface as a political force, both in conservative and in progressive forms. As we know, however, it was the conservative forms that eventually became most politically formidable, and so it has been ever since. Here's the moral of this part of the story. The larger that this particular form of religion has grown on the American horizon, the easier it has become to confuse the battle over feminism with a battle over how much power religion, as such, should exert in the public square. The shift to secularity from the 19th to the 20th centuries was also rooted in differences between white middle-class Protestant women and women who did not fit those parameters. The key point here is this: the nexus between religion and public life was and is extremely different for women in different social locations. African American women, though they shared Protestant Christianity with white women, had a very different experience of church. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham's work on Black Baptist women in the late 19th and early 20th centuries makes this point very, very clear. For these women, Higginbotham shows, it was nothing new to connect their religious life with a sense of social mission. Black churches had always been the mainstay of black social life, not only places of worship, but sites for schools, sports, libraries, publishing houses, insurance companies, and forms for political organization. The black church, then, was what we might call public space for African Americans. But it was so in the context of there being systematically denied space within the white-dominated public world. In Higginbotham's words, the black church became a counter-public sphere, distinct from and in conflict with the dominant white society and its racist institutional structures. Something similar applied to women who were not Christian or not Protestant. For the Catholic and Jewish immigrant women in the 19th and early 20th centuries, it was the labor movement that was eventually to bring them into relationship with the suffrage movement. Catholic and Jewish women were suspicious of the suffragists' evangelical Protestantism, and really their suspicion was not unwarranted. This is not to deny that religion was a strong source of intra-group affiliation among Jewish and Catholic women, and as such, it also mediated their public existence, providing, for example, the basis for education or social provision. But again, if their religions were performing these functions for Catholics and Jews, that was to some extent because the larger society was not going to serve or welcome them. Another illustration would be Native American women. Although they've historically engaged in more public and political activity than any other group of American women, that has hardly meant they have fair access to public power. By the way, I think this is something we should keep in mind these days as government is offering more and more roles to faith-based communities. We're told that this is a healthy revitalization of the civic sphere, but it can also be a way to re-marginalize the groups that are now being remanded back to the care of religion. As I've said, 19th century religious feminism had ideological weaknesses too. One large weakness was its Victorian notion of sexual purity, which was related again to the spiritual and political authority of women. This ideology could never underwrite the sexual agency of women. It could not assist women in naming and living out their own desires, in choosing whether and when to have children, in creating and changing their own patterns of love and family. You know, it's worth remembering that even in the late 19th century, a public woman meant a sex worker. And promiscuous gatherings were meetings where both men and women were present. So it was inevitable that women's demand for full public lives would come into head-on conflict with ideals of sexual purity. And this would also be a head-on conflict with religion. And it's here, when we're dealing with questions of sexuality and reproduction, that the conflicts with religion get biggest, because it's here that we encounter the depths of patriarchalism that do exist in almost all religions. And it's here, when we get into conflicts with basic authority sources, for example, religion, that we really have to ask where the moral authority of women comes from. At this point, I think we have to decide whether or not to claim a moral authority for women that is unmediated by men. If we say yes to this, I think we head in the direction of feminism. If we say no, we go another way. Yet, as scholars of religion know, these processes of contesting and reinterpreting traditions are really anything but new. Religion, like culture as such, has ways of changing and correcting itself. Needless to say, these corrective mechanisms in religion are not always good enough, but nor are those of culture as such. One thing's for sure, though, if we exercise these corrective mechanisms, they get stronger, and if we don't, they atrophy. Ironically, when feminism abandons religion, it actually helps to create religion as irredeemably patriarchal, as incapable of radical change, as absolute and non-negotiable. And we also create another quite bitter irony that for all the differences that contemporary feminism tries so hard to embrace, the one difference that remains outside the circle is that of serious religious conviction. We have to remember that for many women, their relationship with the secular world of politics is constructed in tandem with their relationship to religious traditions. There's a recent study by a sociologist named Crystal Manning that makes this vividly clear. She studied women who had converted or returned to three different types of conservative religion: evangelical Protestantism, Roman Catholicism, and Orthodox Judaism. Unsurprisingly, she found that none of these women identified real positively with the term feminism. However, the Catholics were quite a bit less negative about feminism than were the evangelicals, and the Jews were far less negative than either. Similarly, all three groups saw abortion and homosexuality as immoral, but they related these beliefs to their politics in very different ways. Only the evangelical women believed that law and policy should reflect their religious views on these topics. They saw the fight against abortion and homosexuality as part of a battle to bring America back to its Christian roots. The Catholic women usually felt that abortion should be illegal, but they opposed discrimination against gays and sometimes even supported gay rights laws. And Manning's Orthodox Jewish subjects, despite their belief that abortion or homoeroticism would be wrong for Jews, tend actually to be pro-choice and pro-gay rights when it comes to politics. So we have to let go of the fantasy that while we have many religions in the U.S., we have only one secularism. The meaning of their religion in relation to their citizenship was very different for Manning's three groups of women. The evangelicals, she writes, have an historical conviction that we are America, and this is what determines their response to feminism and distinguishes them from the other two groups of women. Now, I want to underline that Manning's evangelical subjects were really only one slice of an extremely complex strain of American religion, as we know. Still, there's no missing the contrast between them and the Orthodox Jews. In Manning's study, the Jews were much more worried about living in a re-Christianized America than with countenancing the legality of sin. And the Catholic subjects, too, had no ambitions or delusions about converting America to their own religion. Their biggest problem was how to coexist with the liberals in their own church. And they were no more inclined to leave their church than they were inclined to leave their country. Religion and secularity then exist in the plural, and they exist in relation to each other. so we can't map these onto fixed and separate territories. And neither can we do that with feminism, which can be found in various forms at all sorts of sites, both religious and secular. But if feminism and religion bleed into each other's territory, then it makes much more sense to look for the continuities between them than to think of them as categorical opposites. So let's think about the continuities for a couple of minutes. First of all, feminism and religions are both social visions. It's sometimes forgotten that religions are supposed to be more than making sense of our personal lives or more than regulating sexual behavior. Particular visions of society or assumptions about society lie behind the public proposals of religious people and religious groups. Religious people need to name these assumptions rather than assume them, and they need to show how and where the social visions that they derive from their religious traditions overlap with our American political principles, and where perhaps they don't overlap. Feminists, too, owe it to their co-citizens to articulate their politics in terms of a social vision rather than only in terms of individual rights. This makes feminism more a matter of beliefs than of identity, which, by the way, helps resolve a persistent weakness of feminism as identity politics. When feminism is thought of as rooted in women's identities, it's often compared with the civil rights movement. The same strategy is often used by gay rights groups. And like feminists, gay rights activists partly do this to kind of outmaneuver their religious opposition. Just as no citizen should be discriminated against because of who they are racially, the argument goes, so no one should be discriminated against because they happen to be female or happen to be gay. Now, this analogy with race is problematic for all sorts of reasons. It reifies the category of race. It tends to erase people of color who happen also to be women or happen also to be gay. And, of course, it presumes that the problem of racism in our country is largely understood and largely overcome so that it can be used as the basis for other sorts of advances. But for our purposes, the most important thing is this: to see feminism as a matter of beliefs, as a matter of social vision, is to see that the key issues are ethical in the sense of public ethics. We're talking about what's good or harmful for our society, what's fair or unfair, which types of conduct do or don't pertain to the common good, which principles we really need to agree on as citizens, and where we should just let each other be. The beliefs at stake are not just personal, they're social. For feminism, like for religious groups, these beliefs are carried by a particular historical community within our society, but they're also commended to the rest of us. Which means also that feminism can claim roots in those very political freedoms that underlie the freedom of religion. That is, the freedom of conscience, the freedom of expression, the freedom to associate with others, to develop, explore, and promote one's beliefs. To put feminism and religion on level ground is not only to think of feminism in a fresh way, it's also to think of religion in a fresh way, no longer unique in either its privileges or its exclusions. For religion, this would bring some good news. It would mean that nothing should be excluded or discredited in public life simply by virtue of being religion. But if a viewpoint should not be silenced simply because it is religious, neither should it be allowed to trump all others by virtue of being religious. And that would sound like good news to secularists. But there's enough chastening news to go around as well, because just as secular movements like feminism would be challenged to defend their public ethics, so religious groups would be challenged to make their public ethics intelligible to and negotiable with non-believers. Now, it's true we can do a lot of things that do not force us to engage in real discussion or deliberation with our opponents. However, if we encounter our opponents only in the coercive arenas of law and policy, never in human cooperation, if we hear each other only in polemics and never in dialogue, then truly, God help us. Because even the gains won under these conditions remain very brittle, and I think we have learned that from many a protracted political battle. And the resentment of those who feel silenced poisons the common well. To think of religion and feminism on level ground certainly complicates our democratic processes. I've tried to point out several ways it might deepen those processes too. It affords us a greater embrace of the history of women's public activism. It opens a greater respect for women's religious tradition, and with that, a wider embrace of differences among women. It strengthens our ability to surface and assess the values that are embedded in our political discourse. And it can help us, if not agree with each other, at least reach more lucid disagreements. Finally, to think religion and feminism in the same breath might help us foster compassion and hope, which are not just spiritual virtues, they're political virtues. When I'm struggling with passionate political disagreements, I try to remember that in religious contexts, compassion is practiced especially in regard to what one finds repulsive. In the story of the Catholic Saint Francis of Assisi, Francis has to embrace Christ in a leper because lepers were what repulsed him the most. Francis's repulsion was physical, but there is such a thing as ethical repulsion, intellectual repulsion, even political repulsion. I'm afraid that many of us have been trained to think that it's a virtue to not understand what we believe to be wrong. Maybe we've even learned that quasi-virtue from our religions. But in the deepest religious sense, I want to say this is not a virtue. It's a dead place in the soul. And in a world like ours where there is so much we cannot accept, that deadness tends to spread inside us until there's more and more we can't bear to understand. To let the opponent into our hearts and our minds, to really get them, and then see how we fight. This is hard work, truly the work of the Spirit, but it's work that could not be more basic to the health of a democracy. And there are resources for hope, for what religious people might call grace or enlightenment or a sense of the holy. It matters whether people and movements feel that everything depends on them, or whether they feel themselves to depend on a goodness that somehow exceeds them. It matters whether we feel part of something that went on before us and will go on after us, or whether we feel our dreams begin and end with the stories of our separate lives. Such a sense, I think, deserves to be called a vision rather than a delusion or an illusion. Rarely have we seen it together. Rarely have we imagined the same song or been able to carry it together for very long. Still, like our sisters who are Jews or Muslims, Baptists or Unitarians, Catholics or Mormons, we who struggle on behalf of women are the moving edge of a shared tradition. For all its turns and setbacks, that tradition has had its moments of communion, and it can hope for more. Dispersed are we who have come together, is how Virginia Woolf lyricized a gramophone's sad song, adding, but the gramophone asserted, let us retain whatever made that harmony. Thank you.
Thank you very much for setting the tone for our discussions throughout the day with that stimulating talk. We did get a late start this morning, and so we're going to have to abbreviate our question and answer period somewhat, but I think we will take 10 minutes for questions to Kathleen. And would you stand, do we have microphones? Yes, so please, if you would go to the microphones and identify yourself, and you can address your questions to Kathy.
Good morning, thank you. My name is Janine Hall. I'm from Washington, D.C., and it's been a long time since I've sat through a lecture that was as packed and as meaningful and as moving as what I just heard.
Thank you.
I'm afraid, however, that my brain doesn't work as fast as you were talking, and I would very much love to have a copy of your talk, so that. Thank you.
I agree. My name's Roberta Francis, and I'm just very interested in what you said about I forget whose research it was, about the Orthodox Jewish women, et cetera. Just to share a little of, very briefly, experience I had. I was Women's Issues Director for the New Jersey League of Women Voters, and in 1981 we did a study on abortion public policy. We also then took that issue to the National League of Women Voters Convention, and what we found was very similar when we articulated that there were essentially two levels of questions. I called square one the moral debate, and said that essentially that in a pluralistic society will never have a consensus position, but that square two was where we as League of Women Voters were starting, and that is, in a pluralistic society, what should government's role be relative to public policy on abortion? Again, you can never diffuse all the heat and have only light on the subject, but it really helped us grab hold of that issue and let Roman Catholic women who were morally opposed to abortion nevertheless come down in a pro-choice government position. So it was a very, it just reminded me as you described that of what we went through there, and I encourage people in some of these really hot-button issues to separate the debates, is what I said.
Yes. Thank you. I think that's exactly, is it Jean? I think that's exactly, on target, that we need a tremendous amount of work on this notion of public ethics and of democratic deliberation. I think a problem is that we've often, those of us who are more secularists in the way we work or the way we live our lives, have often assumed that certain language or rhetoric of secularism guarantees that kind of public ethic, and it doesn't. Unless we hear the voices of people's particular moral visions. So let me come back over here and then I'll come to you.
Okay, thank you. Charlotte Bunch, Center for Women's Global Leadership. Hi. I had 2 points. One was I would be interested in your, I really like your calling for an articulation of feminism as a social vision. I actually think that's what many of us have always believed it should be. But I think that in talking about rights as over against community, that also reflects a very narrow U.S. approach to rights. So I just want to suggest that when we even think about rights, we need to return to human rights as articulated by the Universal Declaration of Human Rights is actually a very compelling social vision.
Yes.
In which rights and responsibilities are not separated, and in which social and economic rights and the rights of the community and the defense of the community is actually embedded in the individual rights concept. So I think one of the problems we have in feminism and in the U.S. discourse is the way in which we have actually separated out individual rights from its community context, which is actually the human rights social vision.
Thank you.
So,
thank you.
and in that regard, I would like to at least think about when you articulate your critique of rights, that you also pull people back to as a broader human rights vision instead of setting it
Yes.
up as individualism
Yes.
versus community.
Thank you, Charlotte. I thoroughly agree with what you've said, and I really don't mean to set individual rights against a social vision at all. I was trying to simplify, believe it or not. But actually, I think part of our public deliberations have to be questions of individual rights, and those pertain to common good. Those pertain to social vision, and we need to articulate them as such. So thank you for your observation.
And the other point I would love to hear more about is the role of the media in setting up this polarity, because I think all of us have experienced debates in the media, particularly formats like Nightline, not to point that only, but all of them, in which if you have a more nuanced and complex view of the issue, you're simply viewed as irrelevant. You're not allowed to get it out. You can't put that forward. So I think that the media in this country has actually further exacerbated the divide you're talking about and left very little space for people to have this kind of conversation.
You're not invited on
Yeah.
the program, actually.
Yeah, you're not
that's
allowed
right.
on the program if you don't portray your view in that kind of polarized way. So,
Yes.
thank you.
Thank you. Yes.
Hi, I just want to compliment you on how many issues you discuss. So there's a million things I want to bounce off of, and obviously we can't. But let me, sorry, I'm Maureen Fitzgerald. I'm an historian of women, religion, and public policy, so actually this works well for me. I am very intrigued by your analysis of the dichotomy that's drawn, and I think it's absolutely terrific. But let me challenge, let's say you and myself and others who are on the liberal left or somehow more secular, that we talk about the sacred. There's a way in which we're backing off of the sacred in this conversation, and it's one of the ways I think that the conversation can stop. So that, for instance, as an historian, when I talk to students about something like social science being driven by an idea of the sacred is within individuals, and therefore if we can know God through knowing human history, we can have a better sense of a larger sense of natural law. That is the foundation for a lot of what we do. But that link with divinity is not made. So folks who are secular are often as passionate about their ethics, their morals, their sense of righteousness as the right is. But we've been unable to claim God talk to defend it. And we've been unable to see, I think, the difference between, let's say, religious visions that see the sacred as within human experience and religious visions that see the sacred as above and much more apart from human experiences. And I see there's a way in which our divide is so organized around that, and yet it is rarely part of our conversation. In other words, if someone sees the sacred as being in the scriptures, as being in the Bible, as being in church authority, then doing and not doing things can be very important. For instance, on the issue of homosexuality. If you see that as sinful, then in fact just not doing it is the only right thing to do. If you see God as within, then being creative, loving people in a way that not only expresses humanness but is about attaining transcendence is something that is a celebration of divinity and not something against it. So I think that sometimes it's embarrassing, especially for us leftists, to talk about the sacred, and I think we absolutely have to or we'll never go anywhere.
Thank you for your comment, Maureen.
I'm Marie Wilson from the Ms. Foundation for Women. I've had several wonderful experiences at this conference, and one was in my room alone last night, but it was different. I was reading an article which actually detailed a conversation, a National Public Radio interview with another woman at the conference in which I didn't recognize myself. And when I saw it, and she and I have talked, and we are going to talk today, I thought of something that comes up for me as you speak that's enormously practical and not about the wonderful issues you've raised that are theoretical. When I introduced Elizabeth Drew this week, who's written about the corruption of politics in America and money, and was realizing again how much of American politics is driven by keeping people at each other, because the money only comes in when they're enemies, and how much of right-wing women politics are driven by keeping, like, the Democrats don't want anything to happen to the very far right, frankly. I mean, let's get real. In this room, our politics are still driven by our need to keep each other in boxes to keep our movement funded. And that is an issue that we don't talk about, and it is a sacred issue. We don't have tithing to keep. We aren't tithing to be together or to understand. Who would fund our work together?
What about tithing?
No, who would fund? I'm very much asking.
Yes.
They will fund us, quote, the people, to fight each other.
Right.
They will fund, or they will have us on television to fight. But who will put the resources in
for us to be together. There's too much at stake, and that's my practical question that fuels some of my life.
Right. Sure, of course.
No, it's a question. It's not.
It's not rhetorical. How I wish it were, but it's not really rhetorical. I think that you're exactly right. That the exigencies of our funding determine in many ways our public discourse. I think there are some initiatives beginning the I'm trying to remember the name of it, the national conversation types of projects that have been happening out of Washington, D.C., for instance, that are about trying to produce dialogue. There's an organization here in Watertown, somebody could perhaps help me remember it, Jackie, do you know, that is about producing real dialogue. I really do think we need to fund things that are about a democracy at that basic level, prior to advocacy. Do you see? Yeah. Prior to advocacy that funds sort of dialogue and democracy in that way. So I don't know the answer to where all the funding sources would be, but I think there are some examples of the sorts of initiatives that help, and I think we need to talk about producing more of those sorts of initiatives.
It would be a good outcome here.
That could be a great outcome.
And this will be our last question.
My name is Sylvia Ann Hewlett. This year I'm a fellow at the Center for the Study of Values in Public Life at the Divinity School. First of all, a wonderful, rich, challenging lecture. Thank you. I just want to tell a small story that pulling together rights with social mission, and goes to Charlotte's point, I think. 10 years ago, I interviewed Helmut Kohl, the Chancellor of Germany, and I asked him how he reconciled his own personal views on abortion. He's a Christian Democrat, rather traditional in his Catholic views, with heading up a nation that had rather liberal laws on this subject. And he said his goal was to head up a nation that had created the best conditions in the world for having a child. He said if he could do that, abortion would become a secondary issue, and all kinds of folks could pool their passions.
Sure.
And I think that's precisely what we have not done in this country. And I think it does underscore the sacred nature of an expanded, generous vision of human rights, which merges with social purpose.
Thank you, very well said.
We will take one more comment.
I'm Laura Chasen. I'm director of the Public Conversations
That's
Project.
That's what I was trying to remember. Thank you very much,
I
Laura
came
Chasen.
to the microphone before you alluded to us because of the drift of many of the comments and your remarks, and the idea that this is the beginning of a something which will have a life, and that is the whole phenomenon of polarization in public life and the ways in which we all participated. And the dream being, how could we share our resources about how to resist the pulls, the temptation, whether it's for funding, for public airtime, for winning the verbal games. What do we already know in this room about how to resist the alternatives and what resist the temptations and what alternatives there are? I mean, for example, to use, instead of asking, are you pro-choice or pro-life, to ask, what are your views about abortion? I mean, I'm one of the things in working on that issue and others is having to become aware of all the micro ways in which I had been inducted, not only to thinking, but to communicating with people of all persuasions in manners that invited them to perpetuate the polarization. So I would welcome a conversation among us.
What do we already know
about
about
the ethics
this?
of the how?
Great, very well put. Well, thank you all very much.
Okay. I think that we will have copies of Kathleen's talk available for you at dinner. We're going to try to make that possible, but there's a few technical aspects, so I won't promise completely. But I do want to invite those of you now who are registered for the Core Connection conference or other interested guests to join us for the three concurrent panel discussions that will constitute our next session. And if you've forgotten what you have registered for, if you will turn over your name tag, it will tell you which one you choose. And I just want to remind you now of the rooms in which the conversations will occur. Panel A, How Women Influence Religious Activities in Ways That Affect Public Policy, will be held in this building in room 130, which is directly behind me. Is that right there? Thank you. Panel B, How Religious Values Shape Public Policies That Affect Women's Lives, will take place also in this building in room 230, which is on the second floor. And how do people get to the second floor?
Either staircase, and each panel is denoted by a large blue sign on an easel outside the door. Each classroom is one which is right on the side. It'll be easy to find once you pop upstairs.
And finally, panel C, How Public Policies Affect Women Who Influence Religious Institutions, will take place in room 332 on the third floor. And you can take the stairs or the elevator there. Enjoy the panels, and we'll see you at lunch.